recording in progress. So tenakoto, tenakoto, tenakoto. So welcome everyone. And so we're going to talk about our paper, which is part of a larger research project, I would say. And this is just part of the research group. There's quite a few of us. It's really interesting. There's probably about 100 of us. No, there's probably about 9 or 10 or 11 or actually 13 or 14 of us on the paper. But really it's a matter of, it is a large group effort. Basically anyone who participates, whether it's with data collection, whether it's with editing, writing, really is part of the research team. So what we have here is we have Kirsty, who is based here in Wellington. So hello, Kirsty. Mal, who is in space, but is in Auckland, actually.
Yeah, what up?
Nora. We have Melissa, who is also in Albany, or in Auckland. So there's Melissa. We have Tao, who is in Wellington as well. So, and we have KJ, who is in North Carolina. So, and there's me in Wellington. So. What I'd like to do is start off talking about organizational identity, and I'm going to turn things over to Mal on that one. So since that's part of your thesis,
yeah,
I would assume that you should be able to talk about that one.
I can talk about it. Do you want to put?
I hope so.
Shall I put my ugly slide up?
Let's go ahead and start talking about organizational identity, please.
Yeah. So I've got an ugly slide here, folks.
Should be able to share your screen.
Yep, here we go. So hopefully you can see.
I can see your ugly slide, yes. No, I can see your slide, yes.
Okay.
Wow.
So the reason for the ugly slide is because when it comes to organizational identity, there's sort of three questions that come up. So one question is asked by an organization, who are we? But then there's also a question that's asked by those outside the organization, who are you? And then there's a question asked by a member in the organization, who am I? So in the course of trying to understand the literature on organizational identity, I came up with the idea that so there's a corporate expression of organizational identity, and Cheney and Christensen are really good on this, I think. And they talk about how an organization, its organizational identity is an integrated representation of multiple identities that we either assume by answering the question, who are we? And in communication within the organization, we explore who we are, but also it's how we respond to questions from those and statements by those outside the organization from multiple sources trying to tell us who we are as an organization, or commenting or whatever. It could be media, suppliers, customers, you name it. So this all comes together to form this corporate idea of organizational identity, who the organization is, who are we, what is it that we tell ourselves about our values, our vision, our mission, and how we represent ourselves to the world through public relations and marketing. And so as I say, Cheney and Christensen have done, I think, some good work on talking about internal and external factors in this. But then there's also the member has an organizational identity. So an individual brings personal and social identities into the organization with them. And then from these, the member develops organizational identities that are multiple and changeable. And my go-to source for all this is Ashforth with various colleagues. And I think, you can't really talk about member organizational identity without referencing Ashforth, who's done some great work on it. So the member responds to the question, who am I in this organization, and comes up with a personal construct of the relevance to the organization of their talents, their abilities, their experiences, their personality and traits that they bring as part of their extra organizational identity into the organization. And people like Haslam and his colleagues and Hatch and Schultz have done a bit on this. So that's the two sort of, if you like, the two perspectives on organizational identity. Just looking at the two things at the top there, the corporate one, so it connects with assimilation as well. So Van Manen and Shine, and so for the corporate identity, it provides a focal point for socialization as the organization tries to socialize the member into the organization. But for the member, it provides a base for them, who I am in the organization, as they seek to individualize their identity within the organization. Myers and Otzel and Waldeck and Myers, mostly the work of Myers, both has sort of talked about how assimilation and identity and identification all intertwine. Looking a bit further down, so how are they involved in this identification thing? Well, as the organizational member individualizes their assimilation journey, they form an understanding of their identity in the organization. And at the same time, the organization's socialization maneuvers cue the member about the identities it believes are relevant to the organization. So we come down to, well, why is it important? First one is commitment. As people discover their identity, they know what they're committing to, and they know who they are bringing their commitment into the organization. And this covers their thinking, their feelings, their beliefs, and then this produces outcomes. So for the organization, I've sought to summarize those there. The outcomes from having a good sense of corporate identity. Basically, it identifies the uniqueness. This is who we are. This is what makes us different. And it gives, you know, the organization a reason for being, and a reason for operating. And it also gives them a reputation and focus. And then for the member, having a strong sense of identity, organizational identity, means they're more likely to want to stay committed to the organization, to continue. They're more likely to be productive. They feel significant. I am someone in this organization. And then there's a shared focus that they both have, which brings them together. So just to summarize, why is an organizational identity important? Well, first of all, for both the organization and the individual, it gives them a raison d'etre for being, a reason for being, for who they are. It's an anchor for the process of identification and the product of identification. It provides a point of uniqueness. You know, I am not just another cog in the machine for the individual. We are not just another organization producing widgets. We have a point of uniqueness. And then organizational identity provides a point of reference for organizational climate, culture, values, vision, and mission. So the whole idea of organizational identity, I think, is incredibly significant and important. It comes back to the questions: who are we as an organization? Who am I as a member? And the clearer we can answer those questions, the more outcomes we get. So there's my little snapshot on organizational identity.
Okay.
Over to.
Thank you. So over to how COVID influences organizational communication behaviors.
I think it's me.
Yes, it is.
So here I'm to explain how COVID influenced organizational identifications. Due to the pandemic, there is remote work increased dramatically, while face-to-face interactions has decreased a lot. This increased global shift to remote working has dramatically affected how people work and perceive their organizations. As more and more workers have transitioned to working remotely, the relationships such as the supervisor-subordinate relationships have shifted to a more virtual relationship. With such transitions, issues of how members relate to organizations have been impacted. The active process by which individuals relate to themselves to elements in a social scene was defined as organizational identification. An individual has a higher organizational identification indicating a perceived higher quality of connections with other organizational members. Bergson's identity orientation model has explained that the density and the quality of meaningful relationship with others are critical in organizations. And Bergson's construct of a meaningful relationship is similar to immediacy, with both emphasizing features such as closeness, empathy, and positive affect. The immediacy concept has two different but related variables: immediate behaviors and perceived immediacy. Immediate behaviors is from the message sender's point of view. It's defined as nonverbal behaviors that causes message receivers to feel physically or psychologically closer to the sender. And in the US, the immediate behaviors typically studied include eye contact, forward leans, relaxed postures, and smiling. Perceived immediacy is from the point of the receiver, is a change in the psychological distance one feels with a message sender after processing their communicative behaviors, either simultaneously, immediately, or non-immediately. Such feelings could be sociable, unsociable, or comforting or uncomforting. In COVID and online communication, immediate behaviors is called perceived computer mediated immediacy behavior. Such behaviors can be my supervisor's replies is my emails promptly, or my supervisors replies thorough responses to my emails. So in summary, the relationship between organizational identification and immediacy is illustrated through the identity orientation model, with both quality relationship and immediacy features, emphasize features such as closeness, empathy, and positive affect, which I've mentioned before. So to conclude, COVID impact organizational identification through immediacy. And in our study, the study examines the link between supervisor-subordinate relationship and organizational identification. Our study tests the assumption that supervisor-subordinate immediacy explains its organizational identification in 3 nations that experience different levels of COVID lockdown: the United States, Australia, and England. And the next part, Stephen will explain why there is 3 differences of the 3 nations and our main findings. So back to Stephen.
Well, thank you. So yes, I will talk now about really these 3 countries, and it's important for us to know that, and then for those of you who might be watching this later on, that this is part of a larger project to explore how it was nice that, Melissa talked about remote working, how it's impacted the superior or supervisor. We've had a reviewer not like the word superior. So how the supervisor subordinate relationship has changed. And so we really operationalize that or conceptualize that through immediacy in particular. So we use the work of, Kelly, Mahubir, and others to really look at issues of immediacy. And so what we looked at is really our 3 countries, as Melissa said. We look here at Australia, the UK, and the US. COVID is a rare opportunity really to actually understand how governments and how corporations and other groups respond differently to situations. in this case, so much research in crisis communication has looked at how an organization responds to a crisis. What we're seeing here is this situation is very different, where the stakeholders are not an organization and its internal and external members, but the group having the crisis isn't just one little group, it's actually the world having the group. So there's multiple groups having the crisis. So it's a very different form of crisis communication. And so that makes it very interesting to really explore from a communicative point of view, where in this case, it could be intergroup communication, it could be interpersonal, organizational, crisis, political. There's so many ways in which you can explore COVID in this case, which is why so many people are now doing COVID communication research. If we look to the United States, it had a very late response to the pandemic. And I'm going to try my best not to get political. There was an unwillingness to impose national lockdowns and restrictions. The White House, under the then President Trump, tried to minimize the Centers for Disease Control and its recommendations. There are known more and more evidence coming out about disagreements and almost yelling matches between Trump and his scientific advisors, such as Fauci and others. There was interesting situations between how the media framed numerous press releases, press conferences, like the whole bleach drama, where Trump said, well, people could just put bleach in their veins and drink bleach and things like this. There was politicizing of mask wearing, politicizing of hand washing, and I could go on and on. 3 states enforced different degrees of business closures, mask mandates, and stay-at-home orders. And numerous other states did the same thing. But even if you look at each state, what's interesting in the US context, for those who might watch this who aren't from the US, is the US is, it's like a conglomeration of states. So it's a confederacy of states. I hate to use the word confederacy, but it's a confederation of states. And each state has its own governor. So has its own legislature, its own government. And within each state, there's also these things called counties, where each county also has its own leader, which does report to the governor. And the governor kind of reports to the president, but there's a difference between states' rights and federal rights in the US. And so in this case, what you had in many states was you had counties doing one thing versus another county. You had, in the same state, right next door to each other, probably 1 block away, one county imposing strict restrictions and another not doing it. So there was a really decentralized response to COVID-19. That's the best way to put it. And even now, under President Biden, the response has become a little more centralized, particularly with the vaccine rollout, but it's still decentralized because of the way the Constitution, the US Constitution, and the way the laws are set up in the US, where it is going to be decentralized, as opposed to a place like New Zealand, where there's also only 5 million people versus 350 plus million people. And it's a very small, 2 or 3 islands. Here, the federal government, basically, Parliament, and Jacinda Ardern and Ashley Bloomfield, basically with Chris Hipkins, can say what's going to happen, and it happens. It doesn't work that way in the US, just from a structural point of view. First COVID cases in January 15, 2022, first reported. It spread to 50 states in 2 months, 31 million confirmed cases as of April 2020. 31 million, now it's over 33 from what I understand. And over 580,000 deaths in the country. The UK is also a very confusing and complex situation. What you see here is the response has been to, well, let's have herd immunity. Self-isolation, elderly were sent to rest homes and the rest homes were closed. People were told to protect themselves, stay isolated. Let's protect the elderly. Let's do that. That was the first thing that the Johnson government did, protect the elderly. But there were no restrictions on public gatherings, no mask wearing mandates, no real push for other issues except protect the elderly. But in March of 2020, there were lockdowns imposed. But what you see is the response versus England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland has differed. So here you also have 4 different countries all under the United Kingdom. And so each country also had different responses. So just like the US, where you have 50 different states, plus territories, if you consider the US, Puerto Rico, Marshall Islands, and other places, you have a lot more than 50. Here you have 4 different countries under a union, the United Kingdom, each one responding differently, but Johnson did enact laws that said there's going to be one common response, but they didn't really follow through. And things have gotten even more interesting, where most recently Johnson has basically said that all social distancing, all mask wearing mandates, everything is totally out the window and just do whatever you want in the UK. But I'm trying not to be political. If we go to Australia, has been relatively successful, and I knock on wood, relatively successful in comparison, particularly where we collected data in South Australia. And the reason it's important to know we collected data in South Australia is that we can't generalize in the US to all of the US. We just can't. And so we really focused on, the states in which we collected data. And I think that's one of the important things to recognize. If I go back to the US for a moment, is it's important to recognize that, there we collected data in Florida, California, and New Mexico. Each one had different levels of business closure, mask mandates, and so on. England was one country, pretty much the same response in England. In South Australia, it had one response, which was different than, say, New South Wales, different than Tasmania, different than the Northwest Territories, and different than Queensland, and so on. And so our results generalized to that area in which we collected data, which is important to know. What happened is Australia shut down its international border, particularly South Australia, closed its border, and its state border as well, which did not happen in the US. But in this case, the Australian states closed their borders to each other. They opened them up, closed them again, opened them up, closed them again, except Western Australia, which has kept their borders closed basically for the past year and a half. But they've also had just about 0 COVID cases, which is also interesting. Mandatory home isolation, then hotel quarantine for overseas returnees to South Australia, subsidies given to businesses and to those who are unemployed, which has not been the case in England or in the US, except for the extra tax benefits given to those in the US from the Trump and Biden administration, about $1,200 a year per citizen. Am I correct on that, KJ? I think it's 1,200. Yeah, 1,200, I think.
It's 1,200.
1,200. So they've given a lot more in South Australia.
At least the last one was.
The last one was, yeah. They've given a lot more in South Australia. Just like in New Zealand, lots of testing, tracing, quarantine, swift lockdowns in South Australia. 1 or 2 community cases, lockdown, shutdown. Public crisis, large government, response to this, a very clear communication campaign, and so on. The first case was in March of 2020 as well. So each country differed quite a bit. But what's interesting also is each one of these countries, if you look at it, say, from a Hofstadtian or Hall or Schwartz point of view, all would fall under, low context, all would fall under, say, individualistic, all would fall under, say, low uncertainty. And so they all on paper would be similar. But that's why we didn't use any of those indexes or any of those dimensions to compare them. We looked at how the government responded. And that was the important thing for us to look at. When it came to the results, just very briefly on that, is what was interesting for us is we looked at how organizational relationships, specifically supervisor subordinate relationships, relate to organizational identity. In total, we had almost 1,800 participants, 1,776. Results reveal that supervisors perceived computer-mediated immediate behaviors and subordinates perceived immediacy with their supervisors were positive predictors of organizational identity. So basically, the more that I think my supervisor is immediate with me, does behaviors that make them closer to me, so actually signs their email, Stephen, instead of Professor Croucher or Dr. Croucher, actually responds to email, actually looks me in the eye, actually engages with me, the more I identify with the organization. US supervisors were perceived to use higher levels of computer-mediated immediacy behaviors and have more perceived immediacy than Australian and English supervisors. Australian supervisors had higher levels of perceived immediacy than English supervisors as well. And that was what's interesting for us is, while it might seem exploratory, it might seem, well, so what's intriguing, and I can say, and then I can pass this over to KJ and Tao to talk a bit more, is we scoured the literature looking for research that was really talking about identity or identification, because they're different things but related, in these different countries outside of the US, looking in organizations to really see how these constructs from, say, Cheney, Christensen, Ashforth, and others have been explored. They're not. And so for us, it really, not only in that case, adds to the literature quite a bit, but also really adds by really looking at, during this time of COVID, we're really seeing that this issue of immediacy is significant. So I'll turn things over to KJ and Tao to talk really about, based on this, where do we see this research going? What are some future questions, issues, and so on?
Well, I'll speak a little bit real quick about that. You know, one of the main things that I want to talk about just as far as future research was just like what you just basically talked about, was the cross-cultural differences. You know, obviously we only did Australia, UK, and the US, but, you know, the pandemic hit the whole world and everybody handled it differently. You know, it was a good point to say that here in the US, there were, you know, just a county example and how things were different, separate from state to state and even from state to government. So just looking at other countries and seeing kind of, one, you know, how their government is set up, and then what kind of provisions were in place at the time, because that, to me, and as we found in the study, is a big predictor of, you know, people's willingness to communicate and you know, how they perceive their bosses and or superiors. So I know you said don't use a word, but, you know, superiors in the case. So so, and that, you know, essentially just, you know, looking at different areas and seeing how they handle COVID, and even going further now that we're coming to essentially a new norm, so to say, how each area is handling the new norm. You know, what are the current restrictions now? Because I know in the US, you know, as I go out and venture, I don't see people wearing masks anymore. It's kind of a thing that's in the past. Yeah, you turn on ESPN or the news, you might see somebody famous getting a case, or they happen to postpone a fight here or there because somebody got COVID in a certain boxing camp or something like that. But you see those type of cases. But I would be interested to do some research and a study on just comparing, you know, the US and other nations to each other as far as the new norm, because this is something that we're still trying to figure out. So I feel like that is important. And also, one future research is just, like you said, a lot of people didn't study that outside the US, a lot of the things that we did in the study. And one thing that I valued and was introduced to, as far as, you know, with me being new and in the PhD program and everything, is just cross-discipline research. You know, when we publish things as communication scholars, we have to fit a certain criteria, so to say, so it'll get published. But here, as you see, like in here, this study, you can bring people that work in psychology and other areas into it. And I think a conversation does need to happen on possibly accepting certain works into journals, cross-disciplinary, so to say. And I'll let Tao chime in basically on what I just said. But I feel like those three areas right there would be some good things to study going forward. You know, looking at the pandemic, post-pandemic, and then just kind of bringing in everything as a recap and see what's different now. You know, we don't have, I feel, those same theoretical concepts that we used to have just based on COVID. So, but I'll let you chime in and talk a little bit about that.
Right. Thank you, KJ. So I have two more things to add. Like, because we are doing research on the during the time of the pandemic, So a lot of people have had lost their jobs around the world. So they are under the pressure. So they may have responded to the questions really differently. So, and the second thing is that people now prefer working from home more than before. So maybe it's because like they don't want to go to the physical office anymore. They don't want to meet their superiors anymore. So they want to stay away from the conflicts. So that's how we need to study like after the pandemic, like and after the pandemic, people are back to the normal, but it's the new normal. So they need to cope with the new way of working. Like for example, like now in New Zealand, I have a lot of friends, so now they love working from home because they have more free time and they don't have to deal with the conflicts in the office like anymore. So it's the new norm. It's a new normal.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off what she said, I feel like that's a major thing just because it brings so many aspects into the conversation. One, like I mentioned earlier, how are people handling this new norm in different countries? You know, what were their workplace settings like? What was organizational identity across nations and certain, niche organizations looking like? And then coupling that into the attitudes going into the new work environment. I can kind of relate to that because while I'm still here in the US waiting for my visa, I have a temporary job at the university that I went and got my undergrad and grad degrees from. And ever since COVID hit, we've been working remotely. And we're now just getting back to the point where we're transitioning back into the office. And I know even on the different department levels at the university, we're handling it differently. Some people have to go back more than others. We have the flexibility, and we're one of the few who have the flexibility of kind of having an easier work schedule. You know, we are kind of being mandated to come back to the office, but we had the option to come back 2 days out of the work week and do things like that. So I would love to see a comparison as far as other nations, and then also compare that to how they handled COVID in the first place. Because if you had a place, like you said, West Australia, who they was shut down, it was very strict, people knew what to expect from them. They might be able to ease up a lot more returning to work than other nations who may think that they did the kind of the same protocol when it comes to that. So these are all important things to consider as far as future research, talking about COVID-19 and post COVID-19, as talk about different disciplines and also different nations as well.
I think that's really interesting. The idea of basically how people are returning to work is, if you look to New Zealand, is if you compared it to say the US, or let's not even look at the US, let's say compare New Zealand to like a place like say Italy, which was ravaged at the very beginning of the pandemic, is there, if you look to say fear, and I'm looking to those who are here, in New Zealand right now, is, the fear, really, compared to a place that we saw on the news, or if you see India right now or Indonesia, if people are afraid of getting COVID here, compare it to one of those places, we shouldn't have anywhere near the fear going to the office. And so when we shut down for, I think, 4 to 6 weeks. And then after that, the question is really, why are people still not going back to the office?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's more of you can kind of look at it as kind of like a lifestyle. I know even me just working from home, I was talking to Tyler earlier about it, just the convenience, your supervisor can't see and monitor everything you're doing at home, and you're kind of expected to do certain things. And a lot of people, as long as they get those things done, then it's like, hey, I might be able to go do this or that, or I might be able to incorporate some extra things. So it's going to be hard. And I, just looking at people's attitudes going back after that and seeing just overall productivity and coming back to the office, because I feel like a lot of organizations see a slight decrease in productivity just because it's going to take a little bit just to get the gears going again and get people back focused into coming in. And, I feel like people were bogged down going in with certain professions and things like that. And now they had the luxury of remote work, and people who haven't worked from home at all are now loving it, and now they have to go back.
Kirsty, you were.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things for future research was really in management communication, and linking back to what Mel said about identity in the organization. And for managers and their leadership style, it's how do they manage people who are both in the office and remote working, and this sort of hybrid communication of, good face-to-face meetings. But then, as KJ said, when people are at home, how do they have that same style online? What do they need to do to be present for people, to be responding, empathy? There's a real challenge for managers there, that for future research, and what does management mean in the new norm, as you've talked about.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the difference between management and leadership in this new norm. And the issue of also like policies, we wanted to look at it from the management point of view too, is like, what kind of policies do we have? Like now they're saying that, like here in New Zealand, they're requiring that all border workers, anyone has to get vaccinated. But so we look to say from like a business and legal point of view, is that COVID's changing like the laws we have, or not the laws, but like changing the policies workplaces can initiate. And so how is that going to impact, say, identity? How's that going to impact, say, how people work? Where imagine if you're a school, like a kindergarten through like a 12th grade school is, I don't know if they're doing this in the US or not, but should they even require teachers or others to be vaccinated? Imagine if that starts to happen. Imagine in the US, the anti-vaxxers, or in New Zealand, the anti-vaxxers on the West Coast. Imagine those groups, and imagine how that could. So, I mean, all these kinds of things are going to impact us in this new normal, is really how these things come into play when it comes to managing people. These are going to be new policies people are going to have to address. It's one of the things that Massey's already talked about. This is, what will Massey do, and how will they address it? So those are all those kinds of things we haven't even touched on. Right. But that's just in a country like this, where they're really, all of it could be made by the parliament, can make the decision, and everyone would have to follow it. But then if you go to a fractured government, I don't mean in a negative way, but a government that is so many different levels at the federal, state, local, and each thinks they have jurisdiction, that makes an interesting comparison right there. It's the same kind of law and how it affects and how it's communicated even. So like here, one of the interesting things is, our COVID alert system was developed, it was communicated, it was put on all the television stations. It was basically, and let me ask you, do you know why that was done? Or do you know how that was done so easily? How is our COVID alert system, like, the whole Alert 4 and all of the things, like the 4 system, how is that done so easily on all of our television stations, all the radio? How is that done so easily? Like, put on?
Partly it's because they have strong links with the government.
They have links with the government. That's why like BBC can do it in like the UK. That's why some of the French television can do it. But in the US, I can guarantee you there's a lot of the television stations that will not touch that, because they have no government links. They'll be like, no, this is government interference. So even then, the dissemination of a message, it's basically it's government control. And in this case, even then, just that dissemination of that message is easy to do in a country like this, where basically the government does have control over that. While in the US, they ceded that years ago with the Federal Communication Commission, and basically saying the government can't mandate certain things on air unless it's a national emergency, and they could declare national emergency, which Trump never did. And Biden didn't have to, but he should have probably. Anyway, but I mean, there's certain decrees they could do to declare it. But here, it's different. And so those are the kinds of things too, if you look at the structure, and that's where I'd recommend us as you're moving forward, anyone watching or any of you here, is to look at, if you're doing cross-cultural work, to really understand the countries or the states. Like if you're looking in the US, like, you know, if we're looking at these states, like these states were interesting for the very purpose that they were very different, New Mexico, Florida, and California. But it would be also really interesting, like if we were to do this, you know, with the two of us in the room, I could really talk fairly well about probably Nebraska because I have family there. I know what they're doing. I understand their state politics. And I could also talk about New York and New Jersey. Other than that, the other ones I'd have to do research on, which I've done for New Mexico, Florida, and California. Those are the three that I know the most about. And I mean, KJ probably knows pretty much about the region he's in, probably, I would say.
No.
And that's another thing too, if you wanted to do that even within the country, if we wanted to get to that lower level, it's a matter then of, I would know the fine nuances of, say, Nebraska, where like in most states in the US, they have what's called, you know, Nebraska is one of the few places that has what they call a unicameral, where they don't have a House and a Senate in the state. They just have one. They're one of the few states that does that. And so that does impact how laws are made, where they're all voted on in the same house. Unlike in North Carolina, where they have a House and a Senate, right? They have both. So they have to pass through both houses in order for them to pass like a new vaccine law in the state of North Carolina. It is to go through two voting chambers. In Nebraska, it goes through one voting chamber. And so there's all these kinds of differences too, if you're comparing even states, that are good to know. And so that's where you just need to really, that's where that EMIC approach comes in, being an insider. Knowing those things is really critical. And I mean, that's why I was really happy with the papers we did on Australia. Malcolm, for example, knows a lot about Australia. And so he was really good at looking at that. And he was like, yep, this makes sense. This makes sense. But having those people look at those things helps to make sure we're interpreting the results right. And that we're actually saying what's correct. But looking at that level really can help with the comparison. And so think about those kinds of elements and how that makes things different. Like even if you're looking at the future of what is the new norm, I mean, Australia and New Zealand are so different in working culture. If you're not from this area, you wouldn't know that, but they're so different. And then talking about that would be really different. It would be really important. So that's like one of the key things, is really knowing your context, knowing it inside and out, so you can really explain why it is similar or different from your other context. It's really critical. So yeah, like there's so many things about North Carolina I would never know that KJ could tell me, which is important. So what I'd like to do is basically any other thoughts, and then we can wrap up early. Any other thoughts?
Really the only thing I just kind of thought about as you were just speaking was, like I said, not only cross-culturally, but cross-discipline as well. Just like you said, the idea or the example of the marketing thing and how it was so easy to get things on TVs as opposed to, you know, here in the US where people's pride is at an all-time high, and, you know, a lot of even government officials, you know, pride comes into the table, and, you know, you don't want to do that type of stuff. But if you start thinking about it, you know, just from the marketing aspect and the communication aspect, it's important that studies are conducted where you start incorporating both of those, you know, from a psychological standpoint, and just the difference in areas and how people there feel psychologically about certain responses, or just, you know, being a leader or a follower based on what their government has done. So, you know, with me being fairly new, and for those watching, you know, I'm fairly new in the PhD program, and this is actually my first panel. You know, I'm learning different things about, you know, doing studies and getting them published. And one thing that I have learned is just the significance of the ratings behind the journals that you are published or trying to get your publications in. And I feel the criteria needs to be looked at a lot as far as what you talk about. because yes, you do want to focus on, just one area, the communication area, but, based off what you said, we might need to start thinking about how people communicate based on the marketing they see, or the lack of marketing they see, or just so many other areas. And it was just something that after hearing you say that, it just kind of clicked to me as far as just things to look to for me in the future as I continue on my doctoral journey.
I think that's important. It's well said. I think the key thing is, I think you can use that when you're like any kind of work you're doing. For example, a few years back, some colleagues and I looked at a few countries in Europe, and one of the things we were looking at comparing them on was unemployment rates, and we based our comparison on economic reasons. And while we thought that was a great reason to look at organizational dissent, some of the reviewers were like, well, that's fine, but also bring in Hofstede. But for us, I think it's having that dialogue and really talking about, we were basically making our argument was an economics argument, was that people will dissent because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And if we're looking at, like, at that time, it was like Spain, Greece, Italy, Germany, Finland, especially among young people. We're looking at unemployment. One country was 25% among young people, one was 5%, vastly different. And so I think when you're justifying, or when you're even choosing where to compare, I think it really is drawing on different knowledge sets that you have. And so, like, one of the studies I'm doing now with one of our Masters of Analytics students is we're looking at framing. We're doing a framing analysis. It actually is going to be a sentiment analysis, but it's looking at the G7 leaders. And it's really looking at how they framed the COVID on their Twitter accounts. And so for me, a lot of people in communication would be like, well, why G7? Because they're the leaders of the 7 largest economies. That's why it's G7. And so using them from a geopolitical point of view makes perfect sense. They're the G7, they're the 7 largest economies. It makes sense. Do that. And then from there, so the justification and the introduction will be talking about, this is the G7, this is why these are significant leaders, this is what they're doing, this is, talk about, their significance, their importance. And then the rest of it is just basically typical, like, framing analysis and a big data analysis from there. So I think it's really then just really drawing on that to really figure out what you want to do is the key. So yeah, I mean, that's the key thing. It's just, yeah. And that's why I think having different backgrounds, especially if you're working in teams, having different backgrounds makes it interesting.
Right.
Because that can help you look at things from different perspectives. So yeah, it's important. So, okay. So what I will do is I will end the recording since we've wrapped up, basically. And the next panel, just so everyone knows, the next panel, the final panel for the day, so I'm going to do my things here, begins in 30 minutes. And there's one on language, diaspora, and identity. And there's one on news coverage in the digital world. So there are two paper/panel presentations in 30 minutes. So I will be just an observer on one of those. So one of them is by a group from Malaysia, one is a group from Higher School of Economics in Russia. So predominantly. So I will be observing one of those. We should hear shortly about the papers. So I'll be having Aleph. I think she's setting up times for everybody here. So I think I'm in Albany. I think I see you next week, Melissa. I think when I'm in Albany, if not, Aleph will set that up. When I'm in Auckland next week, I think you too, Mal. So I'll be seeing you all soon. I think she's setting up something with you, KJ. And Curious, I think I see you next week as well. So I see you too, Tao. So I will see you all soon. So all the best. Have a good night. Have a good sleep. So I'll see you all soon.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to
Thank
see
you,
you.
Stephen. See you, everyone.
See you at the
Bye.
next panel.